Hello, my name is Katherine Huang. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Notre Dame, and today I'll be sharing the research from my undergraduate senior thesis examining the finance emissions disclosures of U.S. banks and investment firms. So my research question is, do the finance emissions disclosures of major U.S. banks and investment firms align with current regulations and frameworks? And also, how have stakeholders responded to these disclosures? So why is this question important? Well, greenhouse gases, a very prominent one is carbon dioxide, trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and this disrupts the natural balance of Earth's ecosystems, which in turn disrupts our way of life. And carbon emissions are the main cause of global warming. Businesses are the main producers of greenhouse gas emissions. However, in the U.S., they don't face any explicit consequences for contributing to climate change in this way. And so people are concerned about these negative externalities. We've seen the United Nations call together the world's countries for the Paris Climate Agreement, and both the UN and the Federal Reserve have published reports stating that climate change poses risks to banks' loan portfolios. We've seen investors make an increasing number of environmentally related proxy proposals and also greater demand for environmentally related investment options. People have also protested financial institutions for their role in funding fossil fuels. And so banks and investment firms themselves do not pollute very much compared to the industries that they loan to or invest in, such as oil and gas, manufacturing, and commercial airlines. What finance emissions does is it attributes some of those greenhouse gases back to the financial institution providing capital. So in a sense, finance emissions is measuring how many GHG emissions are being funded by the financial institution, and in turn, how exposed the financial institution is to climate risk. So business reporting typically falls in two major categories. We have financial reporting, which is regulated by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. It's required for large publicly traded companies, and a lot of this information is audited by independent third parties. On the other hand, we have non-financial reporting. This is mostly voluntary, and a common form of non-financial report are sustainability reports that cover the topics of environmental, social, and governance data, otherwise known as ESG. And finance emissions falls under this category of non-financial reporting. Now, because finance emissions is a relatively new area of business reporting and it falls under this voluntary reporting category, there isn't a central database that we can go to in order to access the finance emissions disclosures of all the big financial institutions. So in my research, I collect data from 161 reports covering roughly a 5-year span from the 11 largest publicly traded banks and investment firms. And so essentially what I do with my data is I look at how these market leaders are disclosing their finance emissions and what forces are shaping that. I'll also note that some of my data is no longer publicly available. Between the time that I conducted my research and now, some of these financial institutions have taken their sustainability reports off of their website and off of public access. And so here we can see where firms are discussing finance emissions as indicated by the light blue box. We can see where they're disclosing this specific information as indicated by the asterisks, and when they obtain assurance over their finance emissions as indicated by the capital A. You can see that most firms are discussing and disclosing their finance emissions in their sustainability reports. So this is those voluntary non-financial reports that are pretty loosely regulated. On the other hand, you can see that very few firms are discussing finance emissions and no firms are disclosing financed emissions in their Form 10-K. Form 10-K is heavily scrutinized by regulators and investors, and it contains audited financial statements. As such, we can see that these financial institutions do find finance emissions a relevant topic to be discussing in their voluntary reporting, but they do not have enough confidence in that data yet to be putting it in something that is as heavily scrutinized as a Form 10K. And so the voluntary reporting side of finance emissions means there's a lot of options that companies have when it comes to how they want to share this information. So many of the firms use reporting frameworks, and the one from the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, otherwise known as PCAF, is overwhelmingly the most popular. About half of the firms that disclose their finance emissions also share targets, and then very few of them obtain limited assurance over their data. Because there's so much choice in how these firms disclose this information, there is a lot of variation in how these disclosures actually turn out. So the most common metrics disclosed are absolute emissions, and then we also have finance emissions intensity, which is the absolute metric that's adjusted to become a ratio. So on this table, I have data pulled from 2023 sustainability reports, and we immediately notice some challenges. First, even though all of this finance emissions data was pulled from these firms' 2023 reports, some of the firms are reporting information from 2021 and 2019. You can also see that only one firm, JP Morgan, reports a metric for their overall firm, while most of these companies reporting finance emissions choose to do so by sector. However, every firm defines their sectors a little bit differently, and even though they all use the PCAF calculation methodology, some of them are changing the units for what they end up reporting. So this lack of comparability between firms and years makes it really difficult for investors and regulators to actually use this information. And that's not good because these firms are investing a lot of time and effort into measuring and disclosing this information. But if we can't use it, then it's kind of like a waste of effort. So part of the reason for all of this variability in the disclosures is also because the firms face conflicting laws by jurisdiction. At the federal level in the United States, it is voluntary to disclose emissions data, and this has allowed the U.S. states to pass conflicting laws, where some states have or are proposing laws that require large companies to disclose their finance emissions. On the other hand, you have states passing laws that say if a firm discloses their emissions, the state government will no longer do business with them. And then all of the firms in my sample also operate in the European Union, where they will also be required to disclose finance emissions in the upcoming years. And we also see conflicting legal action between jurisdictions. So we've seen the Texas Attorney General take action against the firms for their ESG disclosures and environmentally related actions. And then when the same banks, such as those in my sample, go to the SEC in the United States and they try to avoid environmentally related shareholder proposals, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission says, no, you have to put those proposals through the regular process. We've also seen municipalities boycott financial institutions for not being environmentally friendly enough. So as you can see, these financial institutions are kind of stuck in the middle. Whatever decision that they make, there will always be some stakeholders that disagree with it. And so in conclusion, finance emissions is something that the firms and large financial institutions have found to be relevant as a measure of climate risk. We've seen this in the significant increase in the number of firms discussing and disclosing finance emissions in their sustainability reports, with the majority of the largest financial institutions doing so in 2023. Of the firms disclosing their finance emissions, the PCAF methodology is overwhelmingly the most popular one. And so PCAF would be a good starting point for future regulators who might want to standardize the disclosure process. The most common disclosure forms are an absolute metric and then finance emissions intensity, and many firms like to disclose this information by sector. The largest issue we currently face is the lack of comparability between firms and years in their finance emissions disclosures. We also see significant conflicting stakeholder responses between those that want to see emissions disclosures mandated and those who are strongly against the practice. So as we move forward, financial institutions definitely need to weigh the costs and benefits of finance emissions disclosures. Since climate risk will continue to be relevant to businesses, I think that finance emissions disclosures will continue to be an important part of what financial institutions are considering. And this is a relatively emerging topic in the field of business reporting, so there are many opportunities for future research, and it will be interesting to see how this field evolves going forward. Thank you.